Hi, Anna. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here with you.
So, this has been a very active week for both uh, Prime Minister Netanyahu and for Volodymyr Zelensky. Can you tell me what do you think was the outcome of Zelensky's meeting with President Trump in the White House? Do you think it was an important meeting, or do we not know what came out of it?
We don't yet know what came out of this meeting. What is important to know is that the timing of when this meeting took place. We're now at a very important moment in Russia's war against Ukraine. For the last 6 months or so, we've seen Ukraine making incredible gains with the potential for turning the tide on this war. But timing is really important. It's unclear, even with all the advances that Ukraine has made, whether or not there's a real chance to tip the scale decisively in Ukraine's favor. And that's why American and more broadly Western support for Ukraine right now is so crucial. And it's hard to see if that's really forthcoming.
Now, one theory that is floating around on the non-interventionist right, or if you prefer, the isolationist right, is that Ukraine's recent attack I believe in the Black Sea, directed at
The Caspian Sea.
in the Caspian Sea, was directed at Iran to try and fuse the Iran war with the Ukrainian war. What do you think about what looks to be a quasi-conspiracy theory?
Yeah, this is not serious analysis. The fact of the matter is, there's no pretending that this war is not a global war. We've been here for a very long time. Look at what happened in the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Iran supplied Russia with Shahed drones, and in this way, Iran qualitatively helped Iran wage its war in Ukraine. In other words, Iran helped Russia kill Ukrainians more effectively. And look at where we are today. Russia has reverse engineered these drones. Russia has been supporting Iran in U.S. and Israel war against Iran. There's high likelihood that Russia supported Iran with intelligence. Look at how closely these two wars have long been interlinked for a very long time. What's different now is that it's simply becoming more apparent. Who hasn't at this point fought on the Ukrainian battlefield? Who hasn't supported, for example, Russia's war in Ukraine? It was only a matter of time that we would find ourselves at this juncture. And again, this is a global war. There's no pretending otherwise. And certainly for Vladimir Putin and the way he cast this war, he saw it as something that's so much more than about Ukraine. It's really about the West. So here we are.
How much has Iran been able to assist Russia since the advent of the war with the United States and Israel?
Well, one of the things that's been very interesting to observe is the exchanges between both countries. Even when we look at how Iran has conducted its war against the United States, analysts note that Iranian tactics resemble Russian tactics in Ukraine.
In what sense?
In a sense of targeting, in a sense of in a way that certain operations are conducted. There's clear signs of learning. In another sense, too, for example, Russia has helped Iranians suppress protest more effectively, both with certain types of either weaponry or certain vehicles. There's something called Spartak vehicles that were observed in Iran that clearly came from Russia, and also in terms of suppression of internet, cyber operations. There's some very clear links, even if there's still a lot we don't know about these exchanges. So I think it's this it's this fusion of how Russia and Iran are conducting themselves. Interestingly enough, from the Russian perspective, Russia is being fairly cautious and pursuing a much more nuanced approach. Russia could be doing more, but they're not looking for a direct confrontation with the United States. So that is the way to understand what's happening is precisely what we talked about just now, that this really is a global war. This is a global confrontation. And our adversaries are now backing down.
So in a sense, from your perspective, the term the axis of evil, which was criticized at the time, has actually become a functioning reality.
Yes, I think it is a functioning reality. And what's interesting is that if we look back even into the aftermath of the 12-day war last summer with Iran, some analysts had predicted that, some analysts had described this as a failure for this axis because Russia didn't rush to Iran's rescue in a way that many had expected. But it's a different kind of alliance that's much more flexible and limited and nuanced, and therefore we have a hard time understanding what's happening. We look at the differences among these actors. We look at the differences between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, frankly. But there's something bigger that brings them together, and the way they're waging this battle against us is not how we would expect, and that's the confusion. It distracts from the most important issue. The most important issue is that they are confronting us together.
Now, another piece of evidence for your thesis is the reporting that North Korea intends to send 30,000 troops to Russia on behalf of its campaign against Ukraine. Do you think that's likely that they'll send those troops, and will it have an impact?
I have no reason to doubt it. Certainly, we've seen North Korea do this once before. This reporting comes after Moscow and Pyongyang, sorry, I can't pronounce North Korea. Pyongyang. After Moscow and Pyongyang had opened direct flights for the first time since the Cold War. And that in and of itself is a significant development. And will it make an impact? Of course. What matters is that all of these actors are adding to the fuel to the fire. It's not about whether or not one particular piece is going to necessarily play a decisive role. Rather, that Russia continues to find resources outside the West. It continues to find actors who are willing to help its effort. And it matters together as a sum of its parts. I'm not sure if that's the right expression.
Now, when we talk about Russia, and you talked about the strides, the great strides that Ukraine has made in stymieing Russia, there are still other voices out there, including one that's causing somewhat of a stir, at least on X, is Professor John Mearsheimer, the University of Chicago, who has maintained since the beginning of Russia's invasion that the Ukrainians are doomed. And I guess he said it again in an interview with Piers Morgan. Now, despite all the obloquy that Mearsheimer has attracted for saying that Ukraine is still on the losing end, is it the case that given Putin's tenacity and the population advantage that Russia has, is Mearsheimer completely wrong, or it's still pretty daunting for Ukraine, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly difficult for Ukraine, for sure. Ukraine still finds itself in a very hard place. But I think even if we go back to your earlier question, what you asked about these ties between the war in Ukraine and Iran, Ukraine is showing us, it's demonstrating that they're not simply a victim, that they're instead an incredible asset to the West. And we've seen with how Zelensky has been able to demonstrate that by providing drone technology to the Gulf states. So again, the timing of these events shows what an important partner and ally Ukraine really is, and therefore how important it is for us to support them. But so much remains unknown, which is why timing right now, why we're having this conversation now, is so important.
Now, you know a lot about Russia, which is why I'm curious to explore what you think of Putin's mindset right now. The war has now exceeded the length of World War II,
Yeah.
but Putin seems to be doubling down, or not.
Absolutely. Putin is not looking for what we would call an off-ramp. And this is something that is somewhat unique about the Russians. They generally don't take off-ramps. Historically, Russians stopped fighting when they had no resources to fight. And Russia has not reached that point, even though they are clearly suffering enormous losses.
Up to what, 40,000 wounded and killed a month?
If these numbers are accurate,
Yeah.
again, and what we've seen, what's been also incredible, if accurate, is that Russia is losing people at a higher rate than during World War II. That is an astonishing statistic, and coupled with the fact that, as you said, the war has now gone on longer than World War II. That tells us something very important about Russia and about how the Russian government approaches war. It tells us how we need to approach Russia. This is something that we need to understand about Russia and what it would take to bring this war to an end. Putin is not looking like he's backing down. In fact, even I think a few weeks ago, there was a report right up ahead of Zelensky's meeting with Trump that Putin is willing to make even less concessions. He's not willing to make concessions on land. So the way to bring Russia to a losing position is not through accommodation. It's not through concession. It's through a position of strength.
Now, one of the things that's different between Russia today and the Soviet Union, it occurs to me, you talked about the Russian government.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I wonder, is it even a government? Because it's so centered around one man, Vladimir Putin, and really he is a product of the KGB.
Yeah.
In the Soviet Union, you had these different power centers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at least you had Central Committee and you had the KGB and you had the military.
Yeah.
Do you think it's different in Russia today, that it really is more the rule of one man?
Yes. This is certainly not the Soviet Union. This is a much more personalized rule of one man, which is not unique in the grand scope of Russian history, but Russia has a history of one-man rule prior to the Soviet Union. And you're absolutely right. There's no Politburo. There's no decision making the way it was conducted in the Soviet Union. Putin, if anything, Putin, who comes from this KGB circle, has studied the fall of the Soviet Union very carefully and extracted a number of lessons for himself. And he was determined not to repeat those lessons. And therefore, we might argue he's making different mistakes, but not the mistakes of the Soviet Union. His own experience in the KGB ensured that he would not repeat those mistakes.
Now, is Putin's Russia more repressive than Brezhnev's Soviet Union?
That's a fascinating question.
I mean, has the country gone that far backwards?
Well, I think to the extent that we can tell, it's certainly in that direction. And given Russia's grand scope of history, whether it's Soviet or imperial Tsarist Russia, totalitarian control is very much the norm. It is really the absence of control that's unusual for Russia, and that's why this brief period that we saw with the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s was so unique.
Everything you say is true, but I still wonder if you could have said the same about, to some extent, about Imperial Germany or Germany in the 18th and 19th century was pretty autocratic. And then that system didn't really dissolve completely. You know, you had this brief moment of the Weimar Republic. And after 1945, when the country was occupied, then it became a democracy. Now, Russia was never occupied, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion to you that the country can't transform, despite I realize there are all these obstacles in its path.
Yeah, anyone can change. And I think if we want to take a very long view, we should never give up on the idea that Russia could be a different country. We should also be realistic of what it truly takes to make that change. And you're absolutely right to point to the example of Germany. And in fact, it took precisely not just losing World War II, but years of occupation to help steer in that direction. And Russia, realistically, it's hard to see how Russia is going to be occupied even after the war in Ukraine is over.
Right, but Putin could be leading it occurs to me, to a complete economic and military disaster in which maybe you would have a wave of reform if the country is brought low by this war.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, he's destroying the military.
Yeah.
It looks like an antique, right? I mean, the Ukrainians are really almost bombing the country at will with drones. They're losing 40, 50,000 men a month. The tactics are outmoded. The economy is crumbling. The best and brightest have fled the country because of the war. It doesn't augur well for the future, does it?
It does not, but it still raises the question of whether a better future is really realistic. And to your point about the military, I would say the jury is still out on the Russian military-industrial complex as far as its ability to innovate and produce new weapons, because Russia is now a country that has is geared for war. The entire reason for employing its citizens, it's all about war. But to make even a broader point, to take a step back from specifically the military angle, excuse me, is realistically. Actually, let me start over. I think you make a great point that in order for a country to truly change, it has to hold a fundamental reckoning with itself, and the only way you can do that is if you hit complete rock bottom. There has to be a shattering loss that you have to experience, right? To make that, to shift towards that internal self-reflection. That would be the better outcome, frankly, both for Russia and the rest of the world.
So the other scenario is that it becomes more like North Korea.
The other scenario is that it becomes more like North Korea, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's sobering. I want to turn now to our favorite subject, the Iran war and Israel. When we were talking earlier, you said that you were not particularly concerned, or at least apprehensive, about the current difficulties that the Israeli-American relationship is experiencing. Why not?
Well, historically, the U.S.-Israel relationship has been deep and enduring and based on values rather than merely tactical day-to-day events of the day. During the Cold War, for example, there was a moment in the U.S.-Israel relationship over Israel moving too close to China, and in the end, that obstacle was eventually overcome. We've seen somewhat of an iteration of that in more recent years, again with Israel working a little bit too closely to China, and that led to some tensions in the U.S.-Israel relationship. And Israel since then has shifted. So I think it's an open question. We're still in the midst of this war. It doesn't look like it's going anywhere, certainly in the event, given the events of the last 24 hours. I would simply say that it's too late, it's too early to declare that there's a fundamental break coming. And tensions, frankly, between allies are normal. We've seen that, especially within the NATO alliance, over many years. So my point is simply that it's a much more complex issue than a black and white.
What did you think about Mayor Mamdani's threat to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu, which he then backed down from?
I'm not sure how to take that seriously. I think judging by the amount of jokes on the internet that we've seen, I actually think there's been an oversaturation of jokes about Mamdani and Netanyahu. I think we can leave it at that.
What about the contention that there is a younger contingent of American Jews who are becoming disaffected with Israel because of its response to October 7th and because of the West Bank settlements? That would hit the values argument, wouldn't it?
Well, it's
that Israel is seen as a bully rather than a victim.
Sure, and I think that goes to the issue of narrative and certain talking points versus reality. That is, in fact, far more complex. It certainly also points to a shift, a generational shift within the United States, and it raises the question of the importance again, returning back to why the U.S.-Israel relationship is so important, and that in fact we do share important values, and that we need to work on that.
Tell me about the Iran war. Is it going to be a forever war? Is it going to cool off, boil over, simmer, cool off? Are we in this for the long haul now?
Well, one question is whether or not President Trump believes we're in it for the long haul, and I think that even President Trump has a hard time answering that question. But judging by the events of, again, just this week, we're seeing that Iran is not interested in backing down, and we are faced between a choice of either escalating ourselves or negotiating a potential settlement. But Iran is signaling that it is not interested in a negotiation. From our perspective, analytically, let me say this over again. From an American perspective, backing down from this war is also dangerous, because think of what that signals to our adversaries if that is the course that we take. Now, having said that, Iran is also the weakest it's been in a very long time. And so it becomes a question of timing as well, and who's committed to the long game.
Is Iran overconfident?
Well, I think Iran doesn't have much of a choice. Iran is recognizing that they don't have a whole lot of other options, and they certainly don't want to lose.
Do you think that tell me what you would do if you were, let's say President Trump calls you, he sees this interview and he calls you in 20 minutes and says, what should I do? What would you tell him?
Well, I would tell him that if we're doing this, we have to be committed, that this is too important to our interests, not just in the region, but also globally, and also raises the question of what tools do we have at our disposal? How are we going to conduct ourselves? Whether or not air power alone is going to be enough.
So you would contemplate ground forces?
Well, this is a discussion that took place before. We've backed down from that. But I think it's a discussion that might have to eventually take place. We simply have to reevaluate where we are on the ground.
What do you think?
This war has shown that it is very hard. Well, let me start over. We have not heard a clear articulation from President Trump of what our objectives are in this war. Is it whether or not it's regime change, or is it something else? Is it curbing the Iranian nuclear program? And of course, there's also the question of Iranian ability to project power across the region. So without stating a clear objective, it's hard to answer that question.
Do you think that the United States could effect regime change at a cost that wouldn't be seen as prohibitive by the American public?
I think it's a question of how long of a time commitment we're willing to make. This war is not yet over. And if you look at it from a long-term perspective, Iran has declared, the Iranian government has declared war on the United States, and we've been dealing with this for many decades now. Fundamentally, it's a question of whether or not we want to back down, if we want to negotiate a settlement, or if we want to be committed to it. And it's a question of communication to the American public of what are the objectives, what are the costs, and whether or not that cost is worth the sacrifice.
It sounds like you think this is kind of a crucible for American foreign policy, that the stakes are really high.
I think the stakes are very high because from an American security perspective, from whether you look at it from through the lens of the interest of American partners and adversaries, how America conducts this war is incredibly important. The stakes are very high.
Also, for example, for Taiwan.
Sure, and again, this shows you how interlinked all these conflicts truly are, which is why your earlier question, when we were talking about President Zelensky and the connections between Ukraine and Iran, once again highlights that this really is there's a much more bigger global game that's unfolding across the region. And this is not, this is not unique to this particular war. Whenever the United States is involved in any confrontation, because the United States is a global leader, the world is always watching. And this is a question about the world order.
Now, it is interesting, just as a final query or comment, that Trump did run on America First, and a lot of people assume that he would be a non-interventionist. In fact, the opposite has occurred. He has been intervening in Latin America and now in the Middle East, in Iran. And you're right that he may not have stated a clear objective. But it is interesting, is it not, that he hasn't skedaddled from the conflict?
Yes.
I mean, he's hung tough so far.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's interesting that given especially short-term attention span that we're used to seeing thus far, he has not walked away from this conflict, and certainly we're still in the middle of it. We'll have to wait and see how it unfolds.
Well, thank you for this excellent session.
Thanks for having me.